even with what you just reported for the first time, Judge Sullivan weighing in on this and calling it a very serious offense. So what we know is that Mike Flynn did stay out of the press, which is what they usually request, didn't do a lot of these interviews, didn't go tweeting much, provided extensive information in hours of what were then cooperating interviews and debriefing sessions, and gave up whatever he could give up, and has gotten a leniency recommendation despite some of this behavior we've just been discussing. One other point I want to make as we understand this, if you'll allow me to get a little legal. Yeah, please do. That's why you are the chief. Here's what's happening. When you go into court for a day like today, you're supposed to focus on why what you did wasn't that bad, which lawyers call mitigation. You're not supposed to go in and say, what you did, you didn't do. That's called pleading not guilty, and he already pled guilty. And so what we're seeing, I think, a little bit, and I don't say this to be mean, but I think we're seeing a kind of a clumsiness or a recklessness or a desire to, quote, have it both ways from Flynn and his lawyers. I mean, his lawyers are promulgating the strategy that actually overlaps with the way Flynn, we're told, and he's confessed to, acted in government. This is an individual, for whatever reason, has acted with great courage, served his country for a long time, did things, I'll speak only for myself, did things I don't know that I could ever imagine doing with regard to how he served this nation around the world. A lot of people look at those as the good things. And then at the same time, as he rose up, he made, I think, by his own admission, and you could see why he's in court today, terrible decisions, wanted both ways, acted recklessly. And here he is, standing there holding a recommendation from Bob Mueller, who's not known as a softie, that says no prison time. And what does he do? Instead of what lawyers call mitigation, instead of saying, hey, what I did wasn't that bad, and I also did other good things like serve my country. Instead of focusing on that, his final salvo is a Trumpy, Hannity, Tweety thing. But Trump and Hannity right now haven't pled guilty. So let them do that if you want to make the best argument for him. But he went into that, and I think what we're seeing, we don't know yet what this judge is going to rule. We're waiting on that. But what we're seeing at least is the judge making Mike Flynn take that back under oath and get back to what he's supposed to do, which is mitigation, which is, okay, explain why it wasn't that bad, but you can't take it back. There's no backsies. There's no backsies in federal court when you plead. You always make it so plain. Thank you. Our chief White House correspondent is still standing by. Hallie, what do we know about the relationship right now between this president and his now disgraced general who's in that courtroom? Do they have a relationship still?
You know, not much that we know of, at least not that the president or his White House has talked about publicly, Craig. And it is an interesting question, given what you've seen from others who have been in and around Donald Trump's orbit, right? So you look at, for example, not just Mike Flynn, but Paul Manafort. And we learned just recently that the special counsel said Manafort was having contact with members of the administration fairly recently into the administration, even though he technically didn't have anything to do with the Trump White House and had left the campaign even well prior to that. So there are questions about the contacts here. Now, I will say this. The last day, Mike Flynn had shortest tenure ever, right, for a national security advisor early on, January, February of 2017, when Donald Trump first came into office. The relationship between these men, you have to remember, and we talked about this a little bit, but just I do think it's important context, because if there's something that we know about Donald Trump, it's that he likes loyalty. He prizes loyalty, prizes people who come to him, who stick by him, and who back him even against the odds. That is a way that you could describe Mike Flynn, who came into the campaign in the fairly early days of the campaign and backed Donald Trump when very few other sort of serious Washington people or serious people inside the national security establishment were doing that, Craig. And so that was something that obviously had an impact on then candidate Trump. And when he was elected, 10 days later, he named Mike Flynn as his incoming national security advisor. And that is sort of what sparked a lot of this, because Flynn then began making those phone calls during the transition, began having those conversations, lied to the feds about it, and that's what has him in this trouble currently. You know, I do think that the piece of this where Flynn, remember, it became a talking point in conservative circles, and you even heard the White House press secretary talk about this today, responding to the question of whether Mike Flynn was entrapped, whether he was ambushed, if you will, by federal investigators throughout this process. what you are seeing from Michael Flynn's defense team currently inside this courtroom, from Flynn himself, from the judge, is an acknowledgement that wipes away the possibility of that talking point to move forward, right? Because even Mike Flynn and his team is now, they're now acknowledging, yeah, I didn't get entrapped. I knew what the responsibility was. I knew what my obligation was, and I still lied anyway, essentially. So it makes for a lot of fodder, Craig, for what we hear from Sarah Sanders in, I don't know where the clock is here, but 2 hours, right?
Yeah, 1:30 at last check. While you were giving us that reporting and analysis, more information coming from inside that courtroom there, left side of your screen in Washington, D.C. This is from the government, an attorney from the government apparently saying, quote, "It remains a possibility that General Flynn is going to continue to cooperate with the government. We would like to bring to the court's attention the Eastern District of Virginia case. The defendant provided substantial assistance to the Eastern District in obtaining that charging document. The judge then asked, could General Flynn have been charged in that case? The answer is yes. Judge Sullivan then says, the more you assist the government, the more you help yourself at time of sentence." What is this?
Craig, this is exactly what we discussed on your show here about 10 minutes ago when we said, why did Flynn plead to this? Because he could have credibly been charged with other worse crimes.
Got it.
Now it's on the record. Judge Sullivan, again, doing what judges do here, laying it all out. This is, by the way, good for Flynn. This is Mueller's prosecutors saying, we think we could have indicted Flynn on these other crimes that we indicted this week in the Eastern District of Virginia, and we did not. Because of his cooperation. Again, that's a good thing for Flynn. And here's, again, I want to read what you just read. Yeah. Judge Sullivan, this is just now moments ago breaking. He says, okay, quote, the more you assist the government, that's to Flynn, the more you help yourself at the time of sentence. And this, again, goes to the good news for Flynn, which is that despite some of the other arguing around the edges that we've covered, on the core of cooperating and giving up the goods, flipping on other people and being honest, Mueller's folks are telling the judge now, just moments ago, yep, he did it all the way to the end. That's why we charged these other people in Virginia. We could have charged him. We chose not to. This is how the system works. Now, the president has called this kind of thing what, quote, rats do, which is how thugs and gangsters talk. But in law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, the people who do law enforcement say this is good because they're saying today in court Mike Flynn gave up facts that helped them enforce the law.
Danny, the phrase provided substantial assistance, how do you read that?
Oh, those magic words, substantial assistance. It's a term of art in criminal cases that means that the government, in the government's exclusive authority, has determined that a cooperating witness has provided what's called substantial assistance. And that will warrant the precious 5K1 motion. It is probably the strongest downward gravitational pull on a sentence. In a case like Michael Flynn's, it doesn't make as much of a difference because he's already at the very lowest end of the federal sentencing guidelines, 0 to 6 months, with a recommendation from the government that they would be fine with a non-custodial sentence, with a straight probationary sentence. So that magical substantial assistance is something that Paul Manafort did not earn, that Michael Cohen tried to characterize his help as substantial assistance, but it was not, because that substantial assistance is a very high bar, and the government will only give it if a cooperator is completely forthcoming and completely helpful. It's a real testament to how helpful Michael Flynn has been. But be warned, cooperators still have to pay for their crimes.
Hallie Jackson, what do we know about what this president has said regarding the possibility of a pardon?
Well, as it relates to people that have been inside his orbit, the president has been hesitant to rule out pardons definitively for people. What I think is striking as it relates to Mike Flynn specifically, Craig, is the president's tweet this morning. And forgive me, I was just looking at my Twitter because the president tweeted again. He actually retweeted Mike Pence talking about the so-called Space Force, the Space Command. So perhaps that gives you an indication of what is on, if not the president's, at least his social media team's mind as we are watching all of this go down inside that courtroom in Washington. Here's what's striking as it relates to Michael Flynn, and it's something that you and I talked about a little bit earlier on. The president is wishing good luck to Flynn today. That is, in addition to being a rather extraordinary comment from a president who fired the guy a year and a half ago for lying to his number two. Ostensibly, that was the reason the president gave at the time. This is also a contrast to how the president has treated somebody else who has cooperated, and you can see the president's tweet there, who has cooperated with the special counsel investigation and other investigations. A different Michael Cohen. So, president says, will be interesting to see what Michael Flynn has to say. Good luck today in court to him. On the flip side, you call Michael Cohen a rat. So one question that I have, that our team has for the White House here is, if Michael Cohen's a rat for cooperating, why isn't Michael Flynn also a rat? Where does the discrepancy come in the mind, and I'm talking about the perspective of the president here, Craig? Because clearly he feels much more sympathetic, I think that's fair to surmise from his tweets, toward Michael Flynn than he did towards his former attorney. And there could be a variety of reasons for that.
A White House press briefing for folks who might just be joining us, who haven't been following us here for the last hour or so, set for 1:30 on the East Coast here. We will hear from Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And to be clear here, Hallie, three major stories today that I assume that the press secretary will be taking questions regarding. Of course, General Flynn, by then he will have been sentenced by this judge. What appears to be some sort of deal, perhaps, to avoid a government shutdown.
Well,
maybe. And then the story about the Trump Foundation, the Trump Foundation being forced to dissolve. Am I missing
Happy Tuesday.
Yeah, no, happy Tuesday.
I mean, the Obamacare ruling that came down that we still haven't heard from the president himself about. There's, of course, the stock market issue that's going on. There's the latest reporting on how the Russian disinformation campaign has affected all Americans. There's a lot happening today, right? But on those three stories you talked about, we've been discussing Mike Flynn. It is beyond certain that Sarah Sanders will be asked about the Flynn sentence today. Whatever it is, whenever it comes down, we're here together in it until that happens, Craig. Story number two is this idea. And forgive me, I only say, when you talk about a possible shutdown deal, it may be too early to say the word deal, right? Maybe outlines of an agreement that could be coming together. I would say it is clear that the White House is softening its position, softening the president's stance, no longer saying it's $5 billion for the border wall or bust. Now there appears to be wiggle room. Our Capitol Hill team, according to a note from my colleague Garrett Hake, just ran into, I think, Nancy Pelosi. Doesn't seem like she's wiggling, right? She's not maneuvering, she's not budging on this, so it's going to be up to the president. And then as for that Trump Foundation story, Craig, we did hear back from the Trump Organization attorney who, as you know, said that they are happy that this has been resolved, but the dissolution of the Trump Foundation is another big one we're watching.
Just getting some more information from inside that federal courthouse there in Washington, D.C. Again, Judge Sullivan and General Flynn, this is their exchange, according to our reporters there inside the courtroom. I'll read it for you. We do not have this on tape. Judge Sullivan, there could be a need for further cooperation for you. Do you understand that? General Flynn, I understand that. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Sullivan, if you want to postpone this and come back at some later point, that's fine with me. Judge Sullivan then goes on to say, I have to caution you that the sentence imposed today may not be the same sentence you would get after cooperation ends. The court likes to be in a position to say there is nothing else this defendant can do to help the United States of America. Judge Sullivan then goes on to say, I am going to take into consideration your years of service and sacrifice and your cooperation. But on the very serious crime, as Judge Sullivan calls it, you can't minimize that. Judge Sullivan, quote, arguably, you sold your country out. The court is going to consider all that. I cannot assure you that if you proceed today, you will not receive a sentence of incarceration. 30 seconds here. It sounds like the judge is going to send the general to jail.
As a defense attorney, I have some concerns with that. After all, General Flynn cooperated. His guideline range is 0 to 6 months. Similarly situated defendants often get a straight probation sentence with those guidelines, and that situation, it seems a little surprising.
10 seconds, sorry, Melbourne.
This is tough talk from a judge who clearly does not like what he's been hearing from Mike Flynn lately.
A big thanks to the panel that joined me. A big thanks to you as well. We're going to continue our breaking news coverage. General Flynn set to be sentenced any moment now. See you tomorrow morning.